Hello, and welcome to this edition of Berkeley Conversations. My name is Raka Ray, and I'm the Dean of the Division of the Social Sciences. I'm delighted to welcome you here today to this panel, Thinking About Race, Racism, and Policing After the Chauvin Verdict. The panel is part of the Social Science Division's Towards a Just Social Science initiative, the purpose of which is to build a community actively engaged in the pursuit of knowledge for a better, more just, and more inclusive world, and to foster collaborations among students, faculty, donors, and institutional leaders in order to develop new thinking to create lasting structural change in both academia and other institutions. The work of understanding how Black and Brown people continue to die at the hands of law enforcement does not end with the Derek Chauvin verdict. Indeed, the murder of George Floyd and the far too many George Floyds before and after require us to examine the long history of race and racism in policing in the United States. What does meaningful reform of policing look like? Is the answer abolition? And what would that mean? We have therefore created a panel with leading experts in Berkeley to help us make sense of this history and orient us towards the future. We have a lot to talk about today, so let me first thank all of you who have submitted questions in advance. We hope to get as many of those as we can possibly do so. We'll keep monitoring the question submission forms throughout the event. Our moderator today is Erwin Chemerinsky. Erwin is the Dean and Jesse H. Chopper Distinguished Professor of Law at Berkeley. He's the author of 11 books, including leading case books and treatises about constitutional law, criminal procedure, and federal jurisdiction. His new book, Presumed Guilty: How the Supreme Court Empowered the Police and Subverted Civil Rights, will be out this summer. Denise Hurd is the Associate Director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, a longtime member of the institution's Diversity and Health Disparities Research Cluster, and a professor of public health at UC Berkeley. Her scholarship centers on racialized disparities in health outcomes. In addition to her extensive scholarship in public health, she has also served as Associate Dean at UC Berkeley's School of Public Health for 7 years. Nikki Jones is Professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. Her work focuses on the experiences of Black women, men, and youth with the criminal legal system, policing, and violence. Her current research efforts are focused on the systematic analysis of video records that document routine encounters between police and civilians, with a focus on encounters that involve the police and Black youth in high surveillance neighborhoods. Osagie K. Obasagi is the Haas Distinguished Chair and Professor of Bioethics in the Joint Medical Program and School of Public Health. His research and writing are on bioethics, with a focus on the social, ethical, and legal implications of the new reproductive and genetic technologies. He has a particular interest in developing legal mechanisms that can create the conditions for eliminating health disparities. Jonathan Simon joined the Berkeley Law faculty in 2003 as part of the JD, JSP, and Legal Studies program. He teaches in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, criminology, legal studies, and sociology of law. His scholarship concerns the role of crime and criminal justice in governing contemporary societies, risk and the law, and the history of the interdisciplinary study of law. Finally, Mike Williams is an accomplished executive leader in both the global financial marketplace and intercollegiate athletics. Mike served from 2014 to 18 as the University of California, Berkeley's Director of Intercollegiate Athletics. He served as a trustee for the UC Berkeley Foundation from 2007 to 2018. He also serves on the UC Berkeley's executive board of the College of Letters and Sciences. So these are our panelists. Let me first ask Mike to say a few words of personal reflection. Erwin Chemerinsky will then take over. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Raka, for the invitation to join this conversation. I apologize in advance for not being as crisp as it might normally be. With the rapid pace of current events and the emotion of the topics, I waited to gather my thoughts. Policing and criminal justice is a critical area for social science scholarship to have impact. As we learn more and more about the pervasiveness and the incredibly dire consequences of racism in policing, we can no longer be silent, not as scholars, not as a university, and not as human beings who care about the success and thriving of our fellow humans. This is a human rights issue. I do not feel that my teenage son is any safer after the verdict than he was before the verdict. I have the same anxiousness every time he leaves the house, day or night. When I tell him to be safe and be careful, he gets a little annoyed. Bad juju, he says. I tell him that I'm really saying, I love you and I worry about you. Anthony Mackie, the actor who plays Captain American, recently said, quote, "As a Black man, you're in an abusive relationship with America," unquote. The weight of the worry and fear for your loved ones is just one life-shortening reality for us. We raise children who aren't free and don't have the same experiences as white children. Our children leave the house with the same anxieties that we, the parents, have and more. They are on the front line of this twilight zone world we live in, and they're grappling with the modern four horsemen of the apocalypse: pandemic and economic shock, anti-democracy, climate change, and racism. For example, the media praised the children who used their phones to capture a murder in progress in Minneapolis. Shouldn't we have been shamed and horrified that those girls knew what to do in that situation, or that a trip to get an after-school treat would end up making them eyewitnesses to an authority figure committing a murder? Racism and the fearful relationship with authority is not bound by geography, status, wealth, or any other marker. Shortly after I graduated from Berkeley, I had an encounter in the Channing Ellsworth garage with a UC policeman who blocked my exit, who asked me to leave the car and sit on the curb in a suit while he searched my car. I asked him after he was finished with the search why he had stopped me. The answer: there were burglaries in the neighborhood. I said, "You were obviously watching me. You saw me take something into a friend's apartment and leave with nothing. That's the opposite of a burglary." He said to me, "Are you saying this is racism? Because if it is, you can talk to my supervisor." I decided to just get my car and leave, went home, shaking, cried. The reality of what could have happened in that situation really struck home. I will tell you, though, that I learned a lot from that experience. I learned that day that my Cal degree and my suit and tie would not serve as armor for me. I look forward to the conversation that is about to take place. It's an important time to be thinking about the role of social science in making our world more just and more equitable. The impact of the global and national inequalities are undeniable and a profound threat to our democracy. I applaud Rama's effort to lead in this area, and I am also grateful for the work that this group of great scholars has done and the contributions you've already made.
Thank you, Mr. Williams, for those powerful and important words. The murder of George Floyd almost a year ago focused national attention on the urgent and long-standing problem of race and policing in the United States. I'm honored to have been asked to moderate this discussion among some of our leading scholars on this campus who focus on issues of policing. As Raka said, we're convened after the verdict a couple of weeks ago of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. I think the place to start then is by asking, how should this verdict be interpreted? Is it a triumph of accountability, or is it just a blip due to extraordinary circumstances, such as the video that Mr. Williams mentioned. Maybe to start, I'd ask each of the panelists for their thoughts with regard to the Chauvin verdict and what it means. And for it lacking any other way, why don't we do this alphabetically? Denise, John, Nikki, Osagi.
Thank you, Erwin. This is such a profound panel, and the topic is just incredibly important. And my view of the impact of this verdict is that it was a special, I think it was a very special occurrence. I think the outcome reflected an incredible amount of care and very, very high resources with the prosecution. And it also occurred when the entire world was watching. I mean, the death of George Floyd touched off a renaissance in the Black Lives Matter movement that, you know, not only spread throughout the United States, but was global. And I think that context and the fact that there was a video that, you know, millions of Americans saw with a police officer killing a man on camera with bystanders telling him to stop. I think that was incredibly powerful as evidence, and that it was an incredibly compelling case. So, I think the trial was undoubtedly important. With my background in public health, I was particularly concerned about the fact that the only defense that was used was that, in fact, the police officer, Derek Chauvin, did not kill George Floyd, but George Floyd died because of underlying health conditions. I was grateful that that defense was, just not tenable. It did not hold. It did not stand. And that was important because, for example, in Eric Garner's case, it did stand. And even though that police officer killed Eric Garner, his death was attributed to his own health problems. And so as a public health person, that was galling. And I was so glad to see that in this particular case, that defense did not stand. However, as we're all aware, during the trial and daily, there have been numerous police killings. And I predict that I don't think this is a turning point for a change in what's happening with policing. Hopefully there will be more attention, but the volume of killings that we've seen during the trial itself every day suggests that there is in fact a whole lot more work that needs to be done.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I want to begin by acknowledging that this is not an academic matter at all for my Black colleagues on this call, and I understand fully that one of the consequences of living in a pervasively racialized society is that there are just limits to what empathy can capture and or carry you to. And I see I'm on the other side of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the veil between my own whiteness and the pain that you heard already from Professor Williams. Let me note that, I'm old, I've gone on record predicting that it was likely that there wouldn't be a guilty verdict. And so that suggests, that PhDs can be wrong. I should have been clear on the website that I was mostly thinking about a hung jury rather than an actual acquittal, but all it would have taken is one person to just not accept that the elements had been proven. For those of us in the generation that remember events like the murder of Fred Hampton, and they put the police on trial then, amazingly, with overwhelming forensic evidence and no conviction. Many more will remember the Rodney King beating and then the trial of the officers in Simi Valley. And despite a video, rare at the time, again, an acquittal or a hung jury now. I think it was a hung jury and then they had to go back. No, Erwin's correcting me. It wasn't an actual acquittal.
In the first trial of the officers in Simi Valley in state court, all 4 officers who beat Rodney King were acquitted. In the federal court prosecution of the officers, 2 were convicted and 2 were acquitted.
Thank you for adding that detail. And I want to say, I agree with Denise that, there are a lot of limitations to this as a transformative moment. There was an amazing video that we've talked about. There was really an exquisite job done by the prosecution. You don't normally get the Attorney General of the state and a team of really national lawyers putting on a Hennepin County murder prosecution. So that was extraordinary. But let me give it the most optimistic spin I can. I think we could be in the middle of a culture change, at least for white jurors who for decades have been told that police are fighting an extraordinarily violent war on your behalf and that whatever they have to do, and have been told that Black males in particular are an ever-present danger, even if they're themselves the victim of oppression, that they may become violent and dangerous at any time. And I thought that those cultural forces would persuade at least a couple jurors that the proof wasn't there, and that didn't happen. So I think we may look back on this and say, at some point there's a tipping point. Maybe it was Ferguson, maybe it wasn't till the summer of George Floyd last summer. But those are my preliminary thoughts.
Nikki?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to start by thanking Mr. Williams for sharing that. When I think what you shared at the top of our webinar, when I think about why I care about policing, it's not so much because I care about policing, I care about Black people, right? I love Black people, I love myself, I love my family, right? And on and on and on. Department of African American Studies, right? That's the center. And so the question is, how do we save lives? How do we save the lives of Black people? How do we save the lives of young people in these communities? How do we save the lives of people who are dying quickly in the kinds of events that we've seen on viral videos, and those who are dying, more slowly as a consequence of living in neighborhoods that are subject to aggressive policing? And so when I think particularly about what this verdict means, a couple of days after the verdict was issued, I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, and I opened that with George Floyd's brother, who says that this is historic. It's a historic moment, right? We won. This is justice. And so I think it's important for us to understand what it means to the family who lost the person that they care about and that they love, and to the community more broadly. But when I think about whether or not this is an outright victory, right, I don't come down to that conclusion. When I think about policing and having studied policing over the last decade, I think about it as a combination of extraordinary violence and ordinary dominance. And the extraordinary violence is the violence that was captured by Darnella Frazier and went viral. What Derek Chauvin did was far outside of what we would expect from a normative human interaction, whether you're a police officer or not. And at the same time, what the trial did in framing him as a bad apple was a successful way to prosecute this case, but it left the universe of ordinary dominance almost legitimized and even potentially strengthened. And what do I mean by ordinary dominance? I mean the experience of Mr. Williams, who understands that he has to defer in that encounter with the police officer or risk death. I mean, in the 3rd precinct where George Floyd was killed, that officers, and this was reported by the Minneapolis Star Tribune, shared freely that how you policed in the 3rd precinct and the 3s was different from the kinds of policing that people outside of that neighborhood got. The degradation of routine stops and searches, whether that's verbal or physical, intrusive searches. There were reports of officers frequently bringing people to the precinct for anal invasive searches. That's what gets lost when we focus only on the adjudication of the most extraordinary cases. And so, I think that this is no doubt important, no doubt historic. It continues the most recent movement against police violence, does that while centering, and that movement, as we know, centers the value and the dignity of Black lives, and that started Trayvon Martin's and George Zimmerman not being found guilty for his death, the work that had to be done in order, right, to get Trayvon Martin's death to be taken seriously, right, and then Ferguson and onward and everything in between. And so I don't also, and this will be the last thing I say about this, I think it's important for us to realize that the verdict, even getting to that point, required a monumental effort on the part of organizers and everyday people in the city who pushed back against the police line about what happened immediately following the murder of George Floyd. And that's the kind of work that whenever it gets into the spotlight, that is often what is happening. That's happening right now here in the Bay Area with the killing of Mario Gonzalez by Alameda police officers. That's what it takes, right? And so I think that's important for us not to think that just the system worked in the way that it did. The system was moved by the movement.
Asagi?
Yes, so thank you. First, I want to thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and especially to Raka and Erwin for organizing this effort, and to Mike Williams for his opening comments. In terms of understanding the importance of this verdict, I think Mike Williams said it best in his comments when he said that he doesn't feel his 13-year-old son is any safer now than he was before the verdict. And that's such a profound and sad statement, right? The idea that we can at once understand that this is an important moment of individual accountability for someone who did something heinous to another person. Yet, at the same time that we understand the importance of this moment, we also understand that that individual accountability does not necessarily mean that there will be systemic reform or systemic change to how policing occurs. And I think that's such a key part of the experience of Blackness in America. That is that being able to celebrate victories while also understanding that these small victories do not necessarily mean that day-to-day life will immediately change. And I think that's a struggle that we have before us. That is to say, to understand that we can appreciate at this particular moment that in the context of high definition videos and an unusual situation where police officers and other members of law enforcement testified against another police officer, and the remarkable organizing that Nikki just described. In that particular context, that all came together to allow one particular police officer to be convicted for murder. And the extent to which that it took all this to be leveraged for this one moment of individual accountability shows how much work we have to do in order for any type of meaningful systemic reform to occur. And so I think moving forward, we all have to continue to appreciate these particular moments where things work out in the ways that it should, while also having a sober analysis of just how much more is ahead of us in order for true justice to prevail.
Thank you. Several of you mentioned the number of Black people who've been killed by the police in just the last few weeks. To help frame our discussion, my question to each of you is there a solution? And maybe here, just to do the rotation, if we could start with John and then go to Nikki and Asagi and back to Denise.
I'm eager to hear what my colleagues will say. I mean, I guess the way I think about it is that accountability is not enough. Police officers should be held accountable, but that won't change the danger that Black lives are in as long as policing is on a mission which puts it into confrontation with Black people. And I don't, there are individual officers who clearly are aberrational in the degree of their violence, but there are plenty of officers that are hewing closely to the norms of policing who are also engaged in the kind of routine degradation that Professor Jones and Williams spoke about. And it's not a matter of their personal racism in that classic sense. If you compare police officers today, they're less racist in a kind of classic social psychological sense than police have ever been. They're better educated, they're better trained. And hopefully we can come back to how far we can go toward shifting away from a police model. But in the meantime, I would like to see an effort to take away the power of the police to unnecessarily confront Black citizens the way that, for instance, Dante Wright was just driving around minding his business.
So let me ask you, John, and then move on to each, and I'll ask every panelist this. If you could do one thing that would be likely to have some effect in decreasing the number of Black and brown people killed by the police, what would you do?
Well, it's a combo, and I think we could do it here in California or locally, banning police stops of cars for any kind of traffic that isn't a serious emergency. And secondly, effectively reversing Terry versus Ohio and not letting police use reasonable suspicion as a ground for stopping people.
Nikki?
So I'll answer that part first. End white supremacy. Right. So the police serve the project of preserving the racial order. They have done that historically. They've done that during a time where explicit racism was allowed and not looked down upon in policing. And it's done that through the colorblind era, right, where you have systemic racism built into the system, built into everyday practices. And so what does that mean? It means that in a society that is shaped by racial inequality, police are doing the work of policing the boundaries, right? And the work that I've done, police officers have described very clearly, officers who would not think of themselves as racist, very clearly that they police differently in the projects than they do in nicer and wealthier parts of the city, right? And so we can think about, again, the video that Darnella Frazier took that went viral around the world. And if we're just looking through that lens and looking through the body camera, we're trying to solve the problem of policing. But the problem of policing is about more than policing, right? It's about the context in which we find it. And there is no one solution to that, right? That is about dismantling. And that gets us to, beginning a conversation of understanding the difference between reform and abolition. And so reform is about making changes within the system, using whatever ratchets, to borrow from the work of Paul Butler, that you have, right, in order to make it more difficult, right, for people to violate people's rights. It also can help the system to operate more efficiently, right, which we can think of as a good thing, but often there's lots of evidence to show that that's not necessarily a good thing. But reform stays within the policing paradigm. Right. And abolition is about transformation. And the problem when you think about abolition is, in fact, the anti-Black racism and anti-Black state violence. And so that is where you are directing your efforts, right? Not, solely primarily directing your efforts into reforming a system, right? That in its life, on this land in particular, has shown itself not capable of not doing what it's doing to Black people right now. I can say more, but I will stop there.
Thank you. Asagi?
Thank you. So I think both John and Nikki provided some really excellent ideas in terms of solutions. One thing I would add to that is I think it's important to look at the problem of police violence in a broader context of gun violence in America. Now, George Floyd was not killed by a service weapon. However, many Black and brown people are killed by guns fired by police officers. And I think one issue we have to really think about is whether or not every situation that police officers are asked to go to require that person to arrive with a service weapon. And more to the point, can we think of alternative response teams besides the police who might arrive to a situation where, for example, someone might be experiencing a mental health crisis and have someone who can arrive who doesn't have a service weapon and someone there who is trained in de-escalation and mental health and providing mental health services. So that is to say, just as John and Nikki talked about in terms of limiting the contact that police have with certain communities, that also involves like rethinking and reimagining how we think about public safety officials respond to social or domestic problems and making sure those persons are not people who are wielding weapons. And if we limit the situation in which agents of the state arrive to these situations carrying guns, we can limit, I think, a significant part of the violence. I'm thinking here of Makia Bryant in Columbus, Ohio, who was engaged in a domestic dispute with someone else. And this officer showed up within seconds, fired 4 rounds into her chest and killed her. And I would like to think that perhaps if there are alternative resources available, that might have been a situation that could have been de-escalated without the tragic loss of life. So I think we have to think about the issue of police violence in the broader context of gun violence in America, and making sure that we are thinking more critically and more sensibly about how to de-escalate situations and make sure that guns are not seen as the first way to respond to every dispute.
Denise?
Yes, I think other panelists have made really excellent points. I think I'm going to sort of amplify some of the things that Nikki has talked about, because when I think of the relationship that the police have with communities of color, and the relationship that the entire society has, I think what we're dealing with is really a systemic problem. And I'm just thinking about the criminalization of Black life in general. I mean, we've heard the stories of, somebody bird watching in Central Park being arrested, a child selling water, an 8-year-old the police being called. In the Bay Area, a family trying to barbecue and the police being called. People going to a funeral and the priest telling them to get the hell out of the church. Somebody, a Yale student who's napping in her dorm room, the police, a white student calling the police on a Black student who's a student at the school. So this whole, this paradigm of punishment and criminalization of ordinary Black life. I mean, Black people are going about their lives they're eating, they're driving, they're bird watching, and the police are being called to stop those behaviors. That is, to me, that's very, very disturbing. And from a health standpoint, what we see is that Black illness is being criminalized. Like, a quarter to half of the people killed by the police are suffering from mental illness, right? What's wrong with that picture? I mean, Osagie mentioned that we need to deploy, people, help clinicians maybe to address some of these issues. I've been looking at diabetes because in one of the landmark cases that expanded police power, it started with the diabetic, and I was shocked to learn that, for example, we've had families in crisis call up the police for help or call EMTs, and they've been shot on the spot. So I think what we're looking at is a really systematic problem. And if we think of the drug war and the fact that military tactics have been employed in communities, SWAT raids, battering rams. So I think it's a massive problem. I think it's a problem of white supremacy. And, I think if we think about who is in the police, I mean, we saw the Capitol stormed on January 6th, and we understood that they're, terrorists, Klans members, the Proud Boys, are part of the police force. And so that's why I think that we're looking at major systemic change, the need for that.
The case that was just mentioned by Denise, a case called Graham versus Connor from 1989, and there the Supreme Court said that police excessive force violates the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, so long as it's unreasonable. And when police officers are tried, including for murder, the question is, was it unreasonable? And many reformers think that the appropriate standard should be, was the use of force necessary? Now, did the police officer act reasonably, but was the use of force necessary, essential under the circumstances? Now, moving from reasonable to necessary would be a reform. And this really then goes to what Nikki said. Nikki, you said the question for paradigm is reform or abolition. And what I want to ask each of you is that the right framing of the issue? Is that how we should frame it? And what, if that is the framing, what do you mean by abolition? And is abolition possible? Nikki, I'll start with you, both because of the alphabetical rotation and because you were the one who framed it in this way.
Yes, well, abolition is already happening. I think that, one of the things that can be hard to keep a pulse on after an event like this and the coverage kind of fades is that this kind of national movement, this global movement is playing out on the local level, right? And so defunding the police it is a national campaign, right? The emphasis has shifted to defund the police, refund the community. And in cities across the country, work is happening. One example is this shifting, right, of responses to Denise's point, mental health crises, right? We are asking a question that we didn't ask a year ago. I've been involved in conversations about criminal justice reform, right? And there has been a real shift over the last year. We are saying, when can we not involve the police? Right? When can we shrink our reliance on the police? And so, I think that there's a lot of work already happening, and that, abolitionists are not waiting on our permission to go ahead and do that work, not waiting on us to decide whether or not what the right paradigm is and what the right framing is, because they're already moving forward. And I think in real ways, in ways that will have a long-term impact on the system. The challenge that remains is that as we begin to pare back what we rely on the police for, is that we will always have to deal with the question, the centrality of violence to policing. And so the reform that you mentioned does a bit to restrict that. We know the Supreme Court gives broad power for police violence. That's why this case was so historic. And yet we are going to have to think seriously about when there is a potential for violence, and this is even in mental health crisis. How do you understand that? So if you have someone who's having a crisis and they have a pair of scissors in their hand, well, then do you get the mental health resource team, or do you get law enforcement, right? Because of the justification that there's a potential for violence. I think about this in the case of gun violence and the work that I've done, in neighborhoods where young people are vulnerable both to peer violence and to police violence, right? And I have an understanding of how the decades-long effort to respond to gun violence that's concentrated in cities with the violence of policing, right, has not stopped violence in those places. And so the question then is, what can, and we know we have more evidence that there are the kinds of interventions that exist outside of policing that use some of the same tactics of targeting people who are most likely to be victim of violence, or to use violence, participate in gun violence, target them, and you flood them with resources. Advanced Peace is an example. The Richmond model is an example. Devon Bogan, who started the Richmond model in Richmond, California, he will say that it's motivated by a love for people who are doing things that harm others, but that we care about. And our outcome measure is whether or not they are alive and their lives are changed, right? So all of that is consistent with an abolitionist spirit, one that thinks about freedom more broadly and thinks about what Black people deserve, right, more broadly, and certainly outside of punishment. And so I'll end here just saying something briefly about how we can think about abolition and what I've learned over the last year, because I didn't come into this as an abolitionist scholar. I'm not an abolitionist scholar. There are folks like Joy James and Angela Davis and Mariam Kaba, right, and others that people can read if they and get into if they're interested in that. But thinking about abolition as a vision, as a horizon, there has to be a world that's better than this. There has to be. Thinking again about Mike Williams' experiences, I have students at Berkeley who have had this same exact experience. And I won't ask you how many years later, right, this is, right? We have to have something better than that. And we have to have a vision to get us there. And we have to be able to reduce our reliance or question our alignment with policing, and why we can be so nervous about releasing that. I also think it's important for us to think about, who the we is. And then finally, thinking about what Joy James will say is, does your plan have a blueprint? Right? And what might be a blueprint for abolition is abolition democracy, going back to the work of W.B. Du Bois, and Angela Davis has written on this and others, and thinking about how do we build up the kinds of social institutions that are necessary to guarantee equality in a multiracial democracy. That project failed after Reconstruction. It lost out because white supremacy wanted it to lose out. And so that work is unfinished, right? And so when we see a police killing, some people see a failure of policies and practices, right? I see a failure of our build, and what abolitionists, some abolitionist thinkers will say is that they see a failure of building up that society in which Black kids can in fact be free.
Usagi?
Yes. So I really think the reform versus abolition question is one of the most pressing issues that we're facing right now as a country. And it's a serious question, and it's a difficult one to enter because there are so many different ideas and definitions and visions for what reform entails and what abolition entails. And we could have an entire separate hour-and-a-half panel talking about just the definitional terms alone. But at the same time, I think one thing that the reform and abolitionist viewpoints share is the idea that what exists now is not working. So for example, when Pat Robertson comes out on his television show, it says that what Derek Chauvin did was horrifically wrong and bad, and he should be thrown underneath the jail. That's a sign that even the most conservative right is starting to realize that the existing system of policing has significant problems with it and needs change. Now, the next question as you're presenting us, Erwin, is, well, what's the next step? And I think, we can have a very meaningful conversation about reform as a more incremental approach that is tinkering things around the edges to hopefully improve things, versus abolition, which is much more of a vision of radically changing everything. And I think what we have to keep in mind as we have this conversation is rethinking and reimagining what public safety means. And as Nikki was saying, who feels safe and who's being harmed. And again, I want to come back to Mike Williams' earlier comments that even with the remarkable moment that we experienced with the Chauvin verdict, many people still do not feel any safer now than they did before the verdict. So that is to say that we can't simply rely upon individual verdicts to somehow make this system better. We have to do what Nikki was saying, that is to say, envision something, a new way of doing things, a new way of practicing that can, in a sense, make people not only feel safer, but make them substantively safer. So I think it's important to kind of focus this conversation on what is public safety, what does it mean to make the public safe, who's participating in this conversation, and who's going to really define the terms upon which people are engaged by actors of the state when they try to enforce these norms of safety. And I think that's where the conversation has to go. And that's where we can then start kind of fleshing out what reform and abolition mean and look like on the ground.
Thank you. Denise?
Yes. The question that you've posed is deeply important and also really intriguing. And what I go to is thinking about the fact that the police are part of American culture, they're part of our society, and that what we should be thinking about is what needs to happen in the society that would change policing. Because we are presently tolerating a lot of egregious social conditions. Houselessness in the Bay Area has, like doubled or tripled just in the last 5 years. We have incredible neighborhoods are more segregated now. I mean, the level of segregation is back to what it was before, the 1980s. There are places in the country where people they don't have water. They don't have running water. So there are some terrible social conditions that our country is allowing. And I think that if you look at the difference in neighborhood alone and what the life chances are for people living in those neighborhoods, we can see that, you're not going to feel safe in some neighborhoods. And so I think this question of reform and transformation, I think the society needs to start transforming. And if I can think of, what would happen if we had a different mental health system, would that cut down on like a quarter to half of the police killings right there? if we had adequate mental health treatment, adequate mental health beds before someone gets in crisis. So our health institutions need to be much stronger. The fact that people are being killed by the police in a diabetic crisis, it to me shows the failure of the society to deal with some of the basic institutions that keep people fed, healthy, and housed. And so I would say that we need to look at the broader societal factors, and especially look at them in terms of what happened to Black people at the end of slavery, at the end of Reconstruction, and the rise of white supremacy that dialed back that institution building process. And if we look at right now, we're in an era in which voter suppression is on the rise. And the franchise is extremely important. Civic engagement is important. Political empowerment is important. And if we don't have an engaged, active group of people that are able to make a political impact, then I think we're going to continue to see the same kind of problems that we have now in the society, and with the police who've been designated to police and keep that society the way it is.
John?
Whenever I hear the phrase police reform, I'm taken back to the words attributed to a Chicago ward healer of the early 20th century who was asked about reform, and he said, "Chicago ain't ready for reform." And it just seems like the police and maybe American society ain't ever ready for reform. After all, since this night in Chicago in 1968, when the Chicago police beat up, white reporters and delegates to the Chicago National Convention, this nation has spent billions, maybe trillions of dollars to improve and reform the police. And at some point you have to ask, is the experiment broken? And, when we talk about abolishing police, let's keep in mind that police means something bigger than the police. Police goes back to the early Greek city-states. It's the power of the community to make itself safe, dignified, healthy, and that never gets abolished. The question is, how do we express it? And are the ways we express it compatible with human dignity? And here we go back to a point that Professor Jones has made a number of times, which is the inseparable feature of violence in the nature of policing, violence and routine degradation. And whether you attribute the police, follow the tributary back to the slave patrol, or whether you follow the London police to Boston and Baltimore and New York, they're all based on violence, on keeping people who aren't ready for self-government under control with violence. As late as the 1960s, sociologist Egon Bittner said that policing is the justifiable use of a situationally justifiable use of force. So the real question is, how much do we see violence as necessary to governing our society? To the extent that we see it as necessary to keeping people under control because of their color or queerness or youth, it needs to be abolished. To the extent that we have lots of private violence in our society that we have to contend with, part of it may indeed be around for a while as we move toward an abolitionist horizon. And let me, if I could, bring you in here a bit, Erwin, because often between sort of abolition, which is really a social movement in many ways, a transformational social movement on the one hand, and sort of technocratic reform on the other, has been the idea that the legal system, and particularly the Constitution, could be an engine of transformation, especially rooted in the 14th Amendment, addressing the historic problems of race. So do you think that that was a road that we missed taking, and is it too late?
Absolutely. I think it's a road that we missed taking. We can give so many examples. The Supreme Court saying that police officers can stop people on a pretextual basis. There's a case, Wren versus United States, where the officers just followed somebody until they turned without a turn signal, then pulled them over. And the Supreme Court said, doesn't matter what the motives of the police officer are, so long as they can say they have probable cause that the person changed lanes without a signal. That lets the police pull over anybody anytime they want, because you follow anybody long enough, they're going a mile over the speed limit, or turn without a turn signal, or not stop at the stop sign long enough. John, it's what you said, where the Supreme Court said you don't even need probable cause. All you need is, quote, reasonable suspicion. And the courts never defined that. And in fact, reasonable suspicion can be manufactured after the fact by the police. And every study shows when we give police this kind of discretion, they're going to use it predominantly against Black and brown people. It's the Supreme Court saying that no one can go to court to challenge the legality of the police chokehold. And that was a decision back in 1982. And that, of course, is what killed George Floyd, and Eric Garner, and so many others. These cases and so many others could have come out differently. And I believe they would have made a difference in policing. But I don't think the court we have now or for this foreseeable future is going to do that. So thanks for asking me to talk about that, which is my specialty. Let me ask a question.
Erwin, can I just follow up on just a bit conversational? Because I think a really important point to understand is that as judges, and you know better than I, but as judges are making these evaluations and these decisions, they have an understanding, they live in our world too, and they understand that this will disproportionately impact Black and brown people, that people like them are not the people who are going to be subject to the police, people who live in their communities, their neighbors, right? And so I think that we can't not talk about the racialized dimensions of the law. And this is where the critical race theory perspective is useful. And it's not just about, locating intention, right? It is fact and consequence. I think back to, this scathing dissent from Sonia Sotomayor, who makes a similar point, right? And is, is outraged at the low threshold of intrusion that now exists. Low threshold that exists for bodily intrusion. And so I think it's important for us, we can sometimes think of the law in this kind of idealized way as it's rational and it's like apart from the rest of the world, but in fact, it has served the project of racism as well. And the point that Professor Simon was making and thinking about these two trajectories of policing, I think this is why we always, or the nation, invests in reform again and again, and we are dumbfounded by not seeing, some kind of payback for our investment unless you think clearly about what the investment is in, right? And folks will say, well, it's doing exactly what it's intended to do. But that piece about the slave codes and the history of racially targeted law enforcement, right? So it's not just that slave patrols existed because they existed, they were enforcing the law. And you had a system of policing, paid municipal police forces that developed. And those two projects have always been intertwined. I mean, you can look at the intensified after the fugitive slave law, and it involved policing paid, regular police, what we think of now as regular police officers, and also ordinary white people. And so I think it's really, it is difficult for me to talk about this without always bringing back into focus that this is part of a larger racial project.
Yeah.
Nikki and I, let me ask this. Nikki and I were both talking about the relationship of law to policing. And of course, Nikki's also talking about where does the law come from, the judges and their values. Do others on the panel want to speak to this issue that Nikki was just addressing and that I was responding to from John? Osagie?
Yeah, I think this is such a critical issue that both you, Erwin, and Nikki have raised. And in terms, it speaks to the extent to which the court system has abdicated its responsibilities to provide protections to the public and in particular vulnerable populations. So one thing that Erwin mentioned earlier was this kind of reasonableness standard that shapes whether or not the force used by police is excessive or not. And some of the work that I've done has shown how that very standard has gone undefined by federal courts in terms of what reasonableness means, and how more often than not, the federal courts often defer to police understandings of reasonableness to determine whether or not the use of force was reasonable or was unreasonable or unlawful. And so if you think about that situation, the level of deference that courts have and give to police officers to define what is legally excessive or not, that just demonstrates the extent to which federal courts have, in a sense, not embraced their responsibility to define the law in a substantive way that can protect people. And so this gets to what you're talking about, Nikki, which is how seemingly objective, neutral, and apolitical language, such as reasonableness, is deployed in a particular racialized context to preserve the status quo. And so there's this toxic mix of discretion and deference that is allowed by the courts to make the status quo situation around policing seem like a natural and normal way for policing to move forward. And that's what has to be disrupted, right? That's where we have to engage to make sure that federal courts are actually doing their job in a way to define and interpret the law in a substantive way that puts the health and safety of people first and doesn't simply defer to what police do or define as the lawful outcome. And that's where, at the pressure point, where we can kind of encourage our court system to be much more active to make sure that that folks are being protected in the way that they ought to be.
Denise and John, do you want to speak to this?
I'll pass.
John? I can't tell if you guys are on mute or.
I agree that there's a set of Supreme Court decisions that should be seen as having green lighted police violence. And I think, you know, when we come to terms with this period of our history, it'll bear comparison to some of the really dark moments of racial action by the Supreme Court. I think in California, we have a chance to change some of that, both with our Supreme Court and in the legislature.
Thank you. I want to ask one more question, then go to the audience questions. And this is something that relates to many of you alluded to. How do we create safety, especially in our Black and Brown communities? I grew up on the far south side of Chicago in a neighborhood named Jeffrey Manor, and it is now one of the neighborhoods that has the highest murder rates in the country. And we can look at other cities as well. Policing is clearly not the answer. It hasn't made Jeffrey Manor or other cities safer. What do we do to provide for safety for people, especially when we're talking about these communities? Just continuing the rotation, Osagie, do you want to go first with this?
Sure. So I think there are so many things that we can do. I'll just highlight one that I think is important, and that is trust. So that to the extent that that we will have, you know, agents of the state, you know, participating in communities to provide services, we need to make sure that trust is first and foremost in the way that these agents, whether they're social workers, public health officials, or some form of police agents, that these are folks who are trying to build trust with community members, that they're getting to know community members, get to know their lives, and not simply seen as outsiders who are enforcing the law. And so we have to reimagine public safety in a way that prioritizes building trust with communities and seeing them as true partners and allowing them to participate in how they create and construct what they, or I should say, allowing community members to participate in producing their vision of what public safety means to them, and having that type of cooperative conversation and relationship that allows people to really, again, have that participatory moment where officials are in service to the community and not seen as folks who are somehow enforcing some type of outside law. And I think if we can really focus on that level of trust building, community building, and engagement, that can be an important first step, not the only step, but an important first step to reducing some of the violence that we're seeing.
Denise, your thoughts?
This is really interesting, and it brings me back to some research that I was doing about why and how communities mobilized in the 1980s and 90s. And we were doing work with the Los Angeles Community Coalition. And the coalition, according to its leaders, was formed when families and community members were really concerned about the crack cocaine epidemic, but they were also really worried about how the police was responding to people who had drug problems or were involved in the drug trade. And in their words, these were their neighbors, these were their kids, these were people that they cared about. And so they wanted to have a different approach. And so they ended up forming a coalition, and they decided that the target of their campaigns would be to eliminate some of the environmental problems, i.e. the liquor stores that they saw as magnets for shootings, for the drug trade, for alcohol excess in communities that there was so much economic disinvestment that there were no grocery stores, there wasn't the sort of civic businesses that you need to run a community. And so they mobilized, and in fact, right after the Rodney King riots, they said that unfortunately, it took the riots to do what 15 years of public policy advocating had not been able to do, and that was provide an avenue for that community to reduce the number of liquor stores, because the concentration of liquor stores in places like Southeast LA compared to white suburban neighborhoods was much, much higher. And as I mentioned, without the other kinds of services that those neighborhoods have. And so they were putting pressure to not have that kind of concentration of what they saw as blighted businesses. And in the end, they were able to stop the rebuild, and they reduced the number of liquor stores by, like, I don't know, 50, 75%, and tried to create new kinds of businesses. And what they said was, this is our form of promoting safety in our community, engaging people in the political process. They wrote legislation. They went to Sacramento. Karen Bass was someone that was a part of that movement. So I think that communities, and I didn't know what to expect. And what I saw was people of different multiracial groups came together, because these were people defending their homes. They wanted a place where their kids could walk along the street without finding needles, where they weren't going to be harmed. So I think that's a potential model for communities taking it on themselves to gain civic power and kind of take back their communities.
John?
It's a complicated question. And one of the things that's exciting about the abolition movement is that so many of the activists are coming from communities that experience high levels of violence and are developing strategies that are anchored in their experience. But putting on my criminological hat for a moment, the Chicago that you invoked is a Chicago that was almost run as an experiment in how much you could damage the social order after World War II to create the conditions for violence, segregate the inner city, create all white suburbs, deindustrialize the city, drive freeways through the remaining Black communities to derationate them. Criminologists have long known that law enforcement corrections can only work at the margins of a society that invests in its own social order on a regular basis. And we have largely not done that because of our perception that it's a racial order that we're perceiving. To put it simply, and hope Joe Biden is listening, if you were to invest in wrapping every kid in America between 16 and 26 in the resources to stay in school, to get a trade or onto a union apprentice program, if you kept putting them back on that ladder, no matter how many times they fell off, I think we could reduce violent crime in the society in a decade.
And Nikki?
Yeah, I think that the responses that each of my co-panelists provided are pathways. And so I'll just highlight, a couple of themes. Is one, that we look into communities in which violence is concentrated, and we locate it in individuals. We locate the problems in individuals. There's something about them. What do you do to them, right? And then we have the criminal legal system, right, as the one institution, the system responsible for dealing with that problem. And so two things that we have to recognize, and that I heard, is one, we have to recognize the violence that is being done to these communities and the violence that's been done historically. I do think there are some efforts now in this administration to acknowledge that. And then the question is, what kinds of investments flow from that? Also understanding how the primary response of policing and law enforcement, and I've written about this in my last book, acts as a co-constructor of violence. in the neighborhood. So think, for example, about Chicago and Adam Toledo, who was killed by the police who were running him down because he had a gun. And another person was killed by the police because the officers were running them down because they had a gun. If that's your gun violence intervention program, you are going to stay running, right? You're not going to save lives. And so the question is, what other kinds of intervention programs, right, can you invest in? And I already shared another model. Advanced peace is one model, one that operates outside of law enforcement. To Denise's point, building up the capacity of members of the community, thinking of a community-led, community-forward effort, one that is not, that is centering the community, understanding that community is complicated. And that's why what organizers have pulled off and have forced us to confront over the last decade is so monumental, right? To get that kind of organization. So understanding that it's complicated, but building up the capacity of individuals and building up the capacity of communities. And to John's point, Professor Simon's point, which I write about in the book, is we need, for young people in particular, we need to provide buffers and bridges. We need to protect them from the criminal legal system that is coming for them, right? And so I write about young people who are targets, right? And and some work we're doing now, analyzing video recordings, police officers saying to the young man, "This is the reason why we're on you. The mayor wants us to do this." Now think about it. You're a young person being told that the reason you're being stopped outside of your house is because the mayor of San Francisco wants the police to target you, right? How does that position someone vis-a-vis, right, the rest of society? And so building up the capacity, providing buffers from law enforcement, providing bridges, right, to other kinds of social institutions that are not negative, right, sanctioning institutions like law enforcement. And then the last thing I'll say is something that I shared on a webinar earlier this year with Mayor Lori Lightfoot in Chicago, is that you can't shift, as many people are thinking about doing, to a public health approach, public health understanding of law enforcement and still invest in policing, right? Because policing is always going to chip away at any other kind of investment that you make. So you really have to think about what kind of investments you are going to prioritize. And you can't, just because it's politically favorable, say that you're going to do both, right? And this is something that I've heard not just from Lori Lightfoot, but from others, right? We're going to take both approaches. Policing, right, will chip away in the way that it is done in the communities that I've written about, will take away from any kind of investment. And that is why the violence persists.
What I'd like to do now is go to the audience questions. There are a large number. We'll only get to some of them, and I apologize for those who wrote questions we can't get to. And then I want to save the last 5 minutes and ask each of you in 1 minute for the thoughts you most want to leave the audience with on this topic. But let's go to the questions first, and I'll read them. Police training. Many police are paramilitary, and police training is very similar to military training, which desensitizes officers to killing. Is it possible to change police training so it's not based on a military view of combating the enemy? If so, what would police recruiting and training look like? I don't know who wants to speak to that.
I can speak briefly to it. I mean, it's possible that military training is actually better than police training in terms of guiding enlisted people to be careful for civilian life. I worked with at least 2 students at Berkeley Law who were military veterans and then experienced police training, and both came away concerned that the police training they received encouraged less concern with the safety of civilians than the military training they had received. So there's some irony there. The other point we sometimes hear about the militarization of police is the equipment and the degree to which the policing in general and policing of protest has taken on a military style, sometimes using military equipment. And it's interesting that this is another area of, I think, transformational reform. The Berkeley City Council just voted to basically set limits on whether the police require governmental approval from the city council before the police can take on military equipment. So that could be part of the answer as well.
Does anyone else want to speak on the police training question? I'll read the second question. It is about police unions, and I'm just reading. Police unions have amassed tremendous power that often blocks efforts at citizen oversight. What can be done to curtail their power while still allowing police officers' right to organize? Who would like to speak about police unions?
Professor Simon, you're not going to jump in
I'd
there?
like to say we have an outstanding scholar at the law school, Professor Catherine Fisk, who has spoken recently on this and is quite an expert. I mean, the one thing I'll say is when you look at the evolution of police unions, and they come late because of restrictions on public unions, they make a very distinctive choice to not follow the path of other labor unions. They're not like the nurses or the teachers or the public employees unions. They define themselves around their power to act as law enforcers in a way that I think isn't really consistent with the historic model of unions and has, I think, contributed to the degree to which they have prioritized things that really put the citizen at risk, especially the Black citizen.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, and so, to Professor Simon's point is that what police unions are most interested in protecting, if their behavior and actions over the last 50 years are an indicator, is the right to use violence and to use it with impunity, right? And so that is the battle. And one of the things that I appreciate over this last year, what the movement has forced people to do, some for the first time, is to think critically about police unions and their role and their politics, and also to delve into police budgets in a way that people did not do before this moment. And again, we can be people who don't have a lot of contact with law enforcement and don't spend a lot of time thinking about it, but like some of us do, can think that, police unions are doing, just like, Professor Simon alluded to, the work that other unions do. But I would encourage people to read a recent feature, I believe it was in New York Times Magazine, about a police leader who was very clear that what he was about and what the union was about was amassing power, right? And taking down politicians who were in the way of their amassing, their ability to amass power. And that is what we are confronting. And so when we think about, well, rationally, this would be a way to intervene in this problem, but it's not rational in that way, right? It's not rational in that way.
Let me also add one thing that happened during the week of the Derek Chauvin verdict was the Attorney General Merrick Garland said that he would use federal authority to bring actions against police departments when they have a pattern and practice of civil rights violations. I think this is quite important because police unions in politics, police departments often won't reform themselves. Let me pose this question to the panel. I'm going to step away for just a moment, but then I'll be back. In terms of restructuring police, is it possible to restructure policing from the ground up? Nikki, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. How did you know? And so I would just shift that a little bit and ask us to think, often in these conversations, we end up talking a lot about the police. What we, I think, have done a good job of balancing here is also talking about the people. And so instead of thinking about how we could invest in restructuring policing, we can think about how can we give people the things that they've been asking for historically, which is safety, right? Which are, to some extent, resources, to freedom and mobility, right? And stability, right? And those kinds of things. And then once we start asking that question, the question of what does community safety mean, right? What does public safety mean, divorced from policing? Then we get into a conversation about building up systems outside of policing, and the role of policing diminishes. And so when I think about what I take away from this last year as someone who has done work with this question, how can we improve police encounters with the public? How can we increase trust? How can we train officers to de-escalate? I've done that work, and what I've come out with is that policing will transform, it will adapt to the moment, and will be a more productive space to be in. Understanding that there's work to do within the system, but I also want us to push beyond thinking about perfecting policing, because that is not a project I think that we will ever achieve in the ways that people think about policing.
Are there others who want to address this question? Is it possible to restructure policing from the ground up?
I would just add to it, go back to something Nikki said earlier, that America is very distinctive in having a super local culture of policing. We have 18,000 law enforcement agencies in America. And in many ways, that is a problem in terms of regulation and top-down ordering that you might find in other societies. But there is an advantage, and that is cities can innovate. And we're going to see some cities really take radical steps to reimagine policing. And remember, policing spread, even if, again, you take the sort of London model, it spreads from a handful of East Coast cities to most major American cities in about a 50-year period. So once you have a model, sociologists call this a process of institutionalization. If you get some successful abolition moves at the local level in some big cities, I think that could be replicated very rapidly. And that is a kind of ground up change.
Denise Sorosagi, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I would just echo what John just said, which is I think there are real opportunities at the state and local level to really experiment, see what works, see what doesn't work, and then replicate elsewhere. So I just want to really emphasize that point.
And Denise, any thoughts about reforming?
I agree with what the other panelists have said.
Many of the questions that we received focus on other aspects of the criminal justice system: power of prosecutors, race discrimination in jury selection, racism in sentencing, over-incarceration. All of these, of course, have a relationship to the police too, and the police are part of the criminal justice system. Do members of the panel want to speak to these questions that go to other aspects of the criminal justice system and ultimately how to reform them? And if no one speaks
I'll
up,
just
John,
briefly,
I
just want to remind people that we have millions of people in America still incarcerated. And in the face of COVID, it's been an extraordinary suffering and exposure to illness. But there's also exposure to the kind of violence that George Floyd died from. Many people are killed behind bars, but we don't have the kind of cell phone and smartphone coverage of that. So I think the kind of national consensus we have that we have to reimagine policing has to be redoubled, but it has to be expanded to include reimagining how we respond in terms of sanctions or consequences, so that we're not so reliant on incarceration.
The United States has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners.
And to think about the conditions of people who are living in solitary confinement. So when Professor Simon and I taught a course last spring, we had a survivor of solitary confinement political prisoner come and talk to our class, and the torturous conditions that are allowed to exist. And so what I'll say to this question is that, yes, we have to understand how the system operates independently in silos at times, and also together in ways that reproduce racial inequality. And also I want to lift up the work that people are doing. And so we have in this moment, this articulation, this pushback against police violence. We've had efforts to abolish fines and fees across the country. We've had things like the progressive prosecutors movement, and folks, there are there's critique there as well. Can you ever have a progressive prosecutor in this system? And still, this is a change that has emerged over the last period of years. We have more attention to the kinds of investment that public defenders should receive. Other folks, can add on to this list, but we have efforts to look at what's happening in pretrial and the kinds of decision points that are leading to inequality. We've learned a lot from efforts to reduce racial disparities in the system, and how efforts to change that can at times actually increase those same disparities. And so I think that people understand that it's an entire system. And in some ways, a vision that I have is that, you can have the bolts and the ratchets and adjusting it so that the whole thing collapses, and then something else, right, is built in its ashes. I think that something else is being built right now.
That's a great transition. Excuse me. That's a great transition to the last question I got. Maybe I can put this to Osagie and Denise before asking everybody for wrap-up thoughts, and I'll read it. While waiting for law and society to effectively address systemic racism, what should a progressive police chief do in the meantime? And that so follows what Nikki was just saying. Osagie, Denise, your thoughts?
Well,
sure. So I'm sorry, Denise, please.
No, go ahead, Osagie.
Sure. So I think a couple of things that a progressive police chief could implement is opportunities to reduce adverse contact with police officers or with community members, excuse me. So that is to say, to de-emphasize things such as traffic stops and other types of kind of street searches, and try to emphasize more positive contacts. So again, this gets back to the issue of trust I was talking about in terms of building trust with communities. And also really focusing police training on de-escalation. That is to say, really trying to make sure that officers understand that their role in resolving tense or adverse situations is to first and foremost de-escalate rather than to enter those situations with aggression and with violence. And so I think those are just two very kind of direct and immediate things that a police chief could emphasize.
Yeah, and just before you spoke, Osagie, I was thinking about the fact that those stops are the gateway to the whole system of incarceration. And if we think about the number of people that have been killed who are just doing, simple things like going to a convenience store, that the stops themselves are a real problem. And so I would agree with Osagie on that. I think a progressive police chief can also just become much more invested in, learning about Black Lives Matter, learning about the community, and just getting to be a lot more informed and a lot more open to hearing from people and to understanding what's really going on in the community, and to become an advocate, maybe to become an advocate for abolition. And so I think that, as a part of the society, the police need to recognize the need for societal transformation and for trying to decrease the kind of inequity that we're currently living in that fuels so many of these problems.
All too quickly, we're at our last 5 minutes of this conversation. There's still so much to talk about. But as I said, I'd like for each panelist to take 1 minute, and I apologize, I'm going to be ruthless and cut you off after a minute because we have to finish in 5 minutes. But just 1 minute for the thoughts you most want to leave the audience with this. And maybe we can do this in the reverse order of where we started. So Osagie, Nikki, John, and Denise.
Sure. So again, thank you everyone for this really important conversation. I think what I would like the audience to walk away with is the role that law plays in producing police violence. That is, as other panelists have talked about, there have been a series of critical federal court decisions and Supreme Court decisions that have created the context and circumstances that allow the police to behave in the way that they do. That is to say that there's nothing natural or normal about policing in America. That is, put differently, that the courts have allowed this system to persist and grow in the way that it currently functions. And so that is, I think, an opportunity to both understand that policing itself is a product of these decisions, but at the same time, it also allows us to understand that there are opportunities to change this. So just as this system was constructed by a series of legal decisions that allowed it, it can also be deconstructed, rethought, and reimagined. And so I would encourage us that, into addition to community efforts to rethink policing, that we also put the spotlight on the legal system and specifically our courts to make sure that they're interpreting the law in a way that protects communities.
Thank you. Nikki?
Yeah, so I would, we talked a little bit about abolition today, and we can think about texts and scholars that can help guide us thinking. One of the things that I've taken away from abolition over the last year is that it starts with us, right? It starts in our own deprogramming around who we think, what we think the police are for, who we think deserves punishment, and how we might do that own kind of punishing and surveilling in our homes, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in our schools. And so don't think that it's something that happens out there. Think about it as something that happens with you as well. And certainly that's how I've learned to think about it. And then the other piece is that, remember that the victims of police violence were loved, that people cared about them. And so that this is about more than tinkering with the system. And this is about saving lives.
Thank you. John?
I would kind of go amen to the saving lives. I do think I want to hold out anti-violence as sort of the surging need of this moment. We have way too much violence in our society. We've had it for a long time. We've known it for a long time. And there's wide agreement that our criminal legal system is unable to deal with it and contributes to it. And we really have to ask ourselves in the 21st century, with all that we are and all that we know and all that we've achieved, can't we find some better mechanisms for actually reducing violence than a system that has failed for a couple hundred years?
And Denise?
Yes, I've just, been struck by how important policing is as a part of our society. And I work in a field that I don't think has recognized the centrality of policing. And so from a public health standpoint, I think it's incredibly important for us to understand and intervene in that system, because if we don't, we will never stop the inequality in death and in illness that happen because of this part of our society. That there are 55 times more people experiencing police-related injuries than killings. And the magnitude of that and its impact is something that I don't think is understood. And the last thing I can say is that I too have a son, and I feel like Mr. Williams, I'm still worried about my son, and I would like to be able to move from a society in which I don't have to worry when he says he's going out to 7-Eleven or when he's going on the freeway that that something will happen to him.
George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Walter Scott, Laquan McDonald, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and so many others each week who are killed by police. Black Lives Matter tells us that we have to say their names and remember them. The George Floyd murder, the conviction of Derek Chauvin, gives hope that we may be at a moment where finally long overdue action will be taken with regard to policing. But action requires thought and reflection. And that's why the university plays such a special role. That's why the scholarship of the people you heard tonight is so important. I want to thank my colleague, Raka Ray, for convening this panel. I want to thank Mike and Denise and John and Nikki and Osagi for their powerful and insightful remarks. The conversation will continue.